Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leveraging the New Demographics in Your GuideStar Nonprofit Profile. For those of you who are returning grant space webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you here for the first time, I'm so glad you joined us today. My name is Christine Bunting. I'm the Curriculum Design Manager for Candid, and I'm joining you today from New York City. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Madeline Cardos, Marketing and Communications Associate based out of Seattle, Washington. Madeline and I will be supporting today's webinar. I'll be managing polls, and both of us will be collecting questions you ask along the way, and I'll be posing them during the Q&A, and we'll also be fielding questions via chat in the background. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we want to share with you that on February 1st, Foundation Center joined forces with GuideStar to become Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector by the sector. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. And with Candid, you can find funding with Foundation Directory online and search 140,000 funders and 12 million grants, and increase your visibility with the funder community by creating or maintaining your GuideStar nonprofit profile, something we will be talking a lot about today. You can also continue to strengthen your nonprofit by participating in grant space trainings. We have many webinars beyond this one to move your fundraising skills to the next level. To learn more about our capacity building training programs, you can visit grantspace.org, and I'll include that URL in the chat in just a moment. We offer courses across the country at a location near you and many online. I'd also like to just go over a few items so you know how to take part in today's event. We have a screenshot of the attendee interface on screen now, and you should see something similar on your screen. By default, you're listening in using your computer's audio. If you'd prefer to join over the phone, select phone call to view the dial-in information. In the handout section of the interface, you can download a PDF of today's presentation, as well as find 4 additional PDF handouts. A GuideStar guide on how to collect and share DEI data, the 2019 GuideStar Profile Standard, which is a best practice guide for collecting and sharing information about nonprofits, Equity in the Center's report, Awake to Woke to Work, Building a Race Equity Culture, and last but certainly not least, a PDF containing summaries of reports on LGBTQ grant making by U.S. foundations and foundation funding for U.S. trans communities. Please keep in mind that you can type your questions into the control panel at any time, and Madeline and I will be monitoring that space. We will either field your questions directly, or I'll be flagging questions to pose during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Know that we will also be sending a follow-up email tomorrow, which will link to a recording of this webinar and its associated handouts. So if you'd like to review any section, certainly know that that recording will be there for you. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand the controls over to Jasmine, our lead presenter today. And as I do, I'd like to introduce her and the 2 other folks that we have with us today. So Jasmine Marrow is the Director of Nonprofit Strategy at GuideStar. She develops tools and strategies to help nonprofits share their stories with the world. And many of you are on the call, which is very exciting. Jasmine has over a decade of nonprofit experience and a passion for connecting people and organizations with the tools to help them succeed. With us today, we also have Andrew Plumley. Andrew is the Associate Director at Equity in the Center, a field-wide initiative to influence social sector leaders to shift mindsets, practices, and systems to achieve race equity. A true systems entrepreneur, Andrew focuses on creating true and lasting systems change for the communities he partners with and supports. We're also joined by Tanaja Jordan. Tanaja is Director of Research and Communications at Change Philanthropy. She brings over 10 years of experience in program and organizational development. Tanaja brings to the work an intersectional perspective informed by her lived experience as a Black queer woman who navigated systems of support as a runaway youth. In 2017, Tanaja was awarded one of 6 Vocal Fellowships for early stage social entrepreneurs and founded her firm, My Seed of Change LLC. She most recently served as Social Sector Outreach Manager at Foundation Center, is a founding board member of the Hetrick Martin Institute, New Jersey, and currently chairs the advisory board of the Peter Cicino Youth Project. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Jasmine.
Thanks so much, Christine. I'm excited to be joined today by our partners in this work. Change Philanthropy and Equity in the Center have been invaluable partners in helping us craft the improved demographic section. And you'll hear about that, but more importantly, you'll also have an opportunity to be further introduced and hear more about both of these organizations more fully. So by the end of our time together, I hope that you'll feel equipped with the knowledge and resources to start work on collecting and sharing demographic data on your staff and board in these various ways. So let's take a look at the agenda. First, I'm going to kick us off with some specifics about the nonprofit profile and the demographic section. From there, Andrew will walk us through Equity in the Center's framework and some steps that organizations can take in their own race equity journeys. And next, Tanaja will share some of the work that Change Philanthropy is doing and their insights and perspectives on research with an equity lens. And lastly, we'll have some time for Q&A. Now, Andrew is in the wonderful world of travel difficulties, so he won't be joining us for the Q&A portion. So if you have specific questions about the race equity cycle and your organization's work within that, please feel free to email him, and then Tanaja and I will be joining you for the Q&A section overall. So I want to ground the first part of this conversation in the nonprofit profiles that appear on GuideStar.org. So this is the home where nonprofits are encouraged to move their profiles from strictly a story about your tax information to deeper information about your organization's mission, vision, and full story. It's seen by a wide range of stakeholders. Some funders even ask for certain parts of the nonprofit profile as part of their grant-making process. So it's in this space that we house the demographic information about your nonprofit. And it's here because it's important to your organization's overall story, not just the story about your diversity and equity efforts. Now, to mark the progress and timeliness of information, seals of transparency are awarded at varied levels from bronze to platinum. And there's a handout with a ton more detail on how each of these seals are earned and more information on how you can overall contribute to your profile. And this is where that information goes. It comes from nonprofits and funders and other external sources. And from there, it is shared with millions of users through Candid's web tools. But it does not stop there. Through our partners, your voice is amplified to funders, individual donor platforms, researchers, and more. So when we talk about leveraging the profile and the new demographics section within it, it's in that context of your profile. So not just on the Candid websites, but in the ways that it's traveling to your stakeholders in a ton of different ways. So let's pause for a poll. I'd love to get an idea of how many of your organizations are currently collecting staff and board demographic data. So that's things like race, gender identity, et cetera.
All right, great. So we have the poll currently up, just asking, does your organization collect staff and board demographics data? And I see that almost 60% of you have already voted, and we do have a range of votes, which is exciting to see. So I'll give you just another 5 seconds or so to vote, and it's climbing higher and higher. You can make my day by getting us to 90% if you'd like, and this will really help us get a sense of where you are in this journey. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, so lock in your final answers if you haven't already done so, and I'll share those results out with everyone. So to just highlight here, the answer that came in the most was not yet. At 39%. At 30%, yes, and I'd like to do more. 23% of the room says yes, they are doing this, exclamation point, and 9%, I'm not sure. So I'll hide those results. And Jasmine, welcome your thoughts and turn it back over to you.
So that is wonderful. It's great to see that folks are excited about this, and I'm guessing a lot of the not yet is why you are here. And so we're going to help to walk you through that and what that'll look like, and hopefully share some resources along the way. So I've set the stage a bit about your profile, and now I want to get into some details about demographic data on your nonprofit profile. So since 2014, we've been encouraging organizations to share details about their demographic data on their nonprofit profile. So that's in the categories of gender identity, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability status. So to give you a bit of background, we originally partnered with D5, which is an initiative to increase diversity and conversations about diversity in philanthropy. And because this was the first effort of collecting demographic data at scale, it was a pretty nervous time. So why collect this data at all? And the answer is that for the same reason that you collect and analyze data of any kind about your organization, because it tells us where we are, helps us to better identify where we want to go and how to get there. So at the individual organizational level, that looks like conversations internally and marking a stake in the ground about sharing publicly. And at the sector level, that looks like aggregated data to help us better understand the sector overall, which can inform systems of philanthropy and other ways that we think about our work. So to date, over 19,000 organizations have shared some form of diversity data through their nonprofit profile. So that's a range of things. So from entering numbers themselves to also entering diversity practices, things like whether or not your organization has a diversity manager on staff. Of that 19,000, about 400 were foundations. And also we had a lot of different types and sizes of organizations, which makes us really happy. It shows that this is appealing to a lot of different types of organizations and also accessible to a lot of different types of organizations. So this is a snippet of what the old tool used to look like. And in the 5 years since we launched, we got a lot of feedback, and that went into refining this tool. So what's new? On the content side, we've added leader and co-leader specific information. We heard a lot from foundations and researchers that this is a wonderful way to better understand the overall outlook of an organization and their composition. With the help of Change Philanthropy, we've updated the language throughout to better represent populations and to align with current thinking about diversity and equity. We've also changed out our set of practice questions that we ask. So with help from Equity in the Center, we developed a set of practices which align with their Awake to Woke to Work framework, which you'll hear about more, to highlight practices that bring about more equitable organizations. On the design side, we've worked hard to make a system as a whole that's easy to enter information with more consistent data. We've broken it out into smaller chunks and made sure that we reduce overwhelm in whatever ways that we possibly could. So I want to give you just a quick demonstration of the tool overall so that you can see it in action. I am going to breeze through this pretty fast, but there are a lot of resources that are available for you through the Help Center and other spaces, so hold tight. So where I am right now, which you should see on the screen, is the back end of where you update your GuideStar nonprofit profile overall. And there are a ton of resources about how to go through each of these sections, so I'm going to stick us very tightly just to the demographic section. So if you go here on the left-hand navigation side, you can click this and you'd see an expanded view. If you want to enter information about your organization's leader, you can see here that this is the old GuideStar site, so that's Jacob Harold, and something odd is happening here with what is displaying. Let's give that a second to refresh. All right, so these are each dial buttons that you can click in for each of the questions here. And then next, you can go to each segment of staff. So there's board members, senior staff, and then staff overall. And what you're going to do is enter a number here. And from there, you'll click Start Section for each subsection. So race, ethnicity, gender identity. Note that gender identity is 2 questions. Sexual orientation, disability status. You'll click Start Section, and you'll just start to enter information here. And what you'll notice is as you enter numbers, there is a count that's going to make sure that you stick to your total. And you're not able to save until you hit that total. And you, of course, should not go over. You can also enter, in addition to the ethnicities that we have listed here, races and ethnicities, you can also enter any additional. And so you can enter up to 10 here. Now, because each section looks roughly the same, I'm not going to walk us through each one, but know that that validation is always there and that you're always counting up to those. So let me just close out of there. And so you'll go through that process for the board members, senior staff, and staff overall. And then you can also enter information about the equity strategies. And so Andrew's going to talk a bit more about the specific strategies that we've identified here and what that looks like. But for each of these, you can check a box that says whether or not you do these things. And take this time to also reflect on practices that you would like to start. This is not meant to be punitive in any way. It's just to celebrate the work that you're doing and to start the wheels turning on thinking about that. So that is my very quick overview of what this section looks like and how to navigate through it. I'll just share also that when you come back to this section, you'll be able to additionally kind of shift through changing your demographics, and there is an update window that pops up. This is moving a little slow and I want to reserve us a lot of time. So, here we go. So when you come back in and you change the number because your staff has changed over or something new has happened, you can start to update the section and you'll just walk through each section and you see a little right-hand side of what you've previously entered to give you just a little bit of feedback to help you orient on your way. And so now it is 10. And that matches, and I can move on to the next section. It will walk me all the way through. So here we go. That is what I'll share there, and there's a handout with the specific questions as well as some more resources through our help center and other ways to be engaged with it. But I want to make sure that we have a lot of time for conversation with our partners. So speaking of our partners, I just want to iterate again that this work would not be possible without them. They have been so incredibly helpful in helping craft the way that we think about this section as well as our work overall in the equity space, and how we will continue to analyze and share this data out. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Andrew, who's going to share more about equity in the center.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thanks for everyone who's participating today. It's great to be here. Like Jasmine said, my flight has gotten delayed. There's some travel issues, so I'm in the airport. I'm sorry for any background noise. I'm going to try to get through the things I wanted to cover in a timely manner, and then hand it off. So I really appreciate you being here. So again, I'm Andrew Plumley. I'm Associate Director at Equity in the Center. I've been with Equity in the Center for just about 2.5 years. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Really, what is Equity in the Center, and what have we been doing? You heard earlier that Equity in the Center is really an organization that's looking to shift mindsets, practices, and systems within the social sector to increase race equity. And really what we do is we help nonprofits and philanthropy center race equity as really a core goal of their impact across the sector. And we're really focused on helping organizations build a race equity culture, which I'll go into a little bit more. But that's really a culture that's focused on the proactive counteraction of social inequity within the sector and broadly in the world. And how organizations do that is by defining, implementing, and advancing race equity internally, while also advocating with peers, stakeholders, community members for race equity externally as well. Next slide, please. Great. So before we kind of dig into the race equity cycle and the research that we've been doing over the past 3+ years, it's always great and always is kind of best practice to ground ourselves in some shared language about how we are talking about specific terms, how we're using specific terms, so that we're communicating effectively among all of us and with different groups. And so we use the term race equity, others use the term racial equity. For us, really race equity is the condition where one's race identity has no influence on how one fares in society. So for us, when you think about any kind of social indicator, so when you're looking at health, education, criminal justice, income, etc., when you disaggregate all of that data out by race, there would be no difference there between white folks, black folks, etc. Any sort of racial indicator. And so that's what we're really talking about. And Tanaja might be talking about this a little bit later, but we use the term race equity lens, and really that's something that organizations and individuals use to make sure that they're really sticking true to equitable values. And so for that, at really any decision-making point within an organization or an individual's making any sort of decision, if they're starting a new program, if they're funding a particular organization, you're looking at the disparate impacts that decision might be having on people of color. And so there are plenty of tools that organizations and individuals can use to build out that race equity lens muscle. But that's exactly what we're talking about here. And then in terms of a race equity culture, again, it's a culture focused on proactive counteraction of inequity, both inside and outside of organizations. Next slide, thanks. So what you're looking at here is the race equity cycle, which is really the culmination of about 2.5 years of Equity in the Center research. We got together over about 2 years, over 200 nonprofit executives, philanthropic executives, and DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners that were really going into those same organizations and helping transform culture from really white dominant norms and white dominant culture to ones that are focused and center race equity. And so we got this this race equity cycle after all of our research. You can see here that what we've done is reframed diversity, inclusion, and equity as awake, woke, and work. So at first, when we were doing this research, we started off with a continuum, kind of moving from left to right. You go from diversity to inclusion to equity, and everyone said that that's really not how the work gets done. It's nonlinear work, it's emergent work, it's adaptive work. And so we thought that a cycle was actually framing the work much more. Sorry about this. I know that there's some background. But anyway, so what we've done is reframed diversity, inclusion, and equity to awake, woke, and work. Where in the awake stage, organizations are really focused on representation. People at this point are really doing the numbers counting, the checking the box around the people with different identities within their organization. Really, at this point, very transactional in nature. In the woke stage, this is really where organizations are starting to think about culture and allowing individuals with different lived experience to come into the organization and bring their whole selves to work. This is where we're seeing things like employee resource groups or affinity spaces that are really starting to build out that culture within the organization to decenter white dominant norms. In the work stage, organizations are really at this point doing that kind of internal work of culture shifting, but also advocating for race equity externally as well. So in the work stage, it's really a focus of internal diversity and inclusion practices with advocating with stakeholders, peers, community members, and pushing their own systems and fields towards race equity. And sorry I'm going through this so quickly, but you see here around the cycle itself that there's 7 levers that we've found organizations can activate to move through the cycle. And they're basically best practices or clusters of best practices that we saw organizations use to move through the cycle. You could go to the next slide, please. Great. So here are our 7 levers. These again are clusters of best practices that we found organizations were really focusing on to really move through that cycle. So just really quickly, there's a level for senior leaders, managers, boards of directors, community, learning environment, data, and organizational culture. Each one has specific things that organizations were focused on. And one question we get a lot of the times is where's the kind of the staff lever? Where are the actual people in here outside of leadership? And we actually have built this all into the 7 levers that you see on this slide. And so staff is really embedded into all of those things. I will also say that when you're moving through the cycle, you can enter and exit the cycle at any time. A lot of the times organizations have, external factors that have kind of started their race equity journeys. If there's conversations in the organization around the killing of unarmed Black men, that can start a conversation and start the journey. If a leader that's centering race equity leads and they're really the race equity champion within the organization, we've seen that the work kind of tends to stop. So you can enter and exit the cycle at any point. Normally, I have time to go through some of the levers and really look through kind of the progression between what it looks like, sounds like, feels like within each lever, from awake to woke to work. But I wanted to just kind of, we don't have time for that today, but if you do have questions, I'd be happy to answer those through emails or calls after the webinar. But if you could go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to give a little, a quick quick update on why this actually matters. You know, why are we actually trying to collect this data for folks in the field? And I think there's really four main things that equity in the center values and thinks is quite important when we're doing these sorts of data collection. And the first is that transparency is actually one of the essential drivers in creating a more inclusive environment where trust and authentic relationship can actually be built. Everyone can do the eye test around demographics within your organization and senior leadership, management, and at the staff level. But it's the other things as well that really you need to be transparent so that both internally and externally people know what's going on. And that's actually where trust and vulnerability and authentic relationships are built. And at the end of the day, those are the types of things that race equity requires to do this work. So that's really important for us. It also holds people accountable to living into the race equity values that your organization has, either you know, in terms of what's written down in your diversity statement, or things that you hold as individuals that make up a larger organization. We can say that we are about this work, we can say that we're trying, but without some sort of way to be held accountable to that, we tend not to reach the levels in which we're all looking for. Again, another thing is really in order to live into these practices, we have to find ways to operationalize the work so that we can have more equitable processes and take some of the unconscious bias out of the decision-making process. And again, by kind of thinking through some of the processes that your organization has and reporting what you are doing, that's going to hold us all accountable, but also it will help in really operationalizing things. And lastly, organizations will be better able to address internal inequity when tracking these practices. So you're really going to need to do some data collection, but then have longitudinal or trend data around how we're actually building capacity internally to address some of the inequity there. But you can't do that without actually getting a baseline of where you are in your own process. Great. Next slide, please. So some of these, I'm gonna actually just go through one or two of these before we go. But we basically, these are some of the case studies, these mini case studies that we pulled out from the research to show how some of the practices in which we're asking you to track have actually showed up within organizations. And so I wanted to give you, maybe we'll just go through the board one, and then and then there's other ones that we can send out the slides to. But let's just go through these really quickly. And these are actually pulled right from the research. And so in the awake stage at Year Up, at the board level, they conducted a review of its board member selection process, and then based on those outcomes, revamped composition of the board with the express purpose of really getting a unique perspective and skill set onto the board, and that they're actually bringing in alumni to that. And so one of the questions is around boards and the work with boards around data collection. So I wanted to bring this one into play. You'll see that when you go through the whole process. I'm also boarding now, so I'm gonna have to go to the next slide. I'm sorry about that. If you can go to the last one, just how to get started. I think this is really, really important. So what I was trying to model earlier on is that you need to establish a shared language within your organization. That's really important because a lot of the times we're misusing terms, or we're using terms differently, I should say, around diversity, inclusion, equity, race equity. And so making sure that everyone's using the same terms when having conversations is really important in building capacity to do the work internally. It's also really important to have a few race equity champions at the senior leadership level and at the board level to really drive this work. Without senior leadership and board buy-in, the work is going to become stagnant, and there's going to be a dissonance between the staff level and the readiness that they might have in driving this work forward, and the preparedness of the senior leaders to do the work. I think it's also super important to align race equity as a strategic imperative for your organization. The more you can align race equity and race equity practices to the actual mission of your organization, the better off you will be. Again, open a continuous dialogue about race equity work, brown bag lunches, having conversations is building up a muscle and getting comfortable being uncomfortable. That's really a large piece of the work. And lastly, really one of the big parts of Candid is disaggregate data. We're not going to understand the inequity both within your organization and externally without disaggregating data. And if we're not doing that, we can't actually address the problems and inequities that we all actually came into the social sector to fix. So those are really some big ones. And I'm sorry, all, I'm the last one that's going to board. I wish I could spend more time with you. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your time, and we really appreciate you. Safe travels, and yeah, I just a few closing remarks around that. This is incredibly important, and a ton of really great information is shared here, and it'll all be in that slide deck. So you will have a ton of information. So I'm going to pass the baton off to Tanaja, who's going to share more about the Change Philanthropy work.
So hello, everybody. As Jasmine stated, I am the Research and Communications Director at Change Philanthropy. And if we could just get to my first slide, I'll begin telling you a little bit about who we are. So Change Philanthropy was founded in 1993, originally as the Joint Affinity Groups, in order to unify identity-focused philanthropy affinity groups into one empowered coalition. We began with 7 original members: Asian American, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, ABFI, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities, emerging practitioners in philanthropy, funders for LGBTQ issues, Hispanics in philanthropy, Native Americans in philanthropy, and the Women's Funding Network. Over time, we added some collaborating partners: the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, Neighborhood Funders Group, and the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, to form a 10-member coalition. And so together, our partners work to integrate diversity, inclusion, and social justice into philanthropic practice in order to transform the sector's culture to be one that embraces equity. And what makes Change Philanthropy unique as a coalition is our advocacy of community priorities of our partners with an intersectional approach. So each partner on their own organizes resources and builds connections that represent the communities that they promote. And we collect that lived experience in order to shape our work every day, giving us a connection to the strengths and assets of different communities, as well as to the needs of these communities. We could move to the next slide. Our overarching goal is to really work with philanthropic funders on investing with intention so that their impact is visible in the communities that need the most. And so to get there, we advocate for equitable philanthropic practices that address structural and institutional change. And we also coalesce several individual groups and audiences in order to achieve this. We believe that united, we can move the philanthropic sector forward and create real change in our societies. And so with that in mind, we have 5 major strategic approaches. We celebrate impact by recognizing foundations who've made a strong commitment to advance equity across all communities. We build knowledge through offering a curated resource hub of data, best practices, events, and tools, all with an equity lens. And you can access those on our website, changephilanthropy.org. We expand leadership. We deepen relationships with the leadership pipeline to authentically engage diverse and experienced candidates. We create connections. So we foster collaborative spaces to strengthen bridges across the sector, to support partnerships in shared practices and strategies for impact. And then finally, we cultivate partnerships. We initiate and coordinate programs to promote effective intersectional approaches to ignite positive social change. And you can again learn more about all 5 of our core areas on our website. We've got curated sort of content and materials under each approach. So now we can go to the next slide. So in line with our building knowledge work, the Research and Data Sharing Working Group of Change Philanthropy leverages the collective wisdom of our network toward more equitable, inclusive, accountable data collection and analysis. What does this mean? You see there's an astronaut on the screen. Let's consider this example. 60 years ago, if you would have used the term space cadet to describe someone, you would have described someone who was actually preparing to go to space. And now today, decades later, the term space cadet has evolved to mean something completely different, as it has been supplanted in that professional community by the word astronaut. You can go to the next slide. And so I like to use this example to demonstrate to folks that language, like knowledge, is pragmatic data. Both what we know and how we share what we know have evolved over time in response to new information and social changes. This is especially salient for marginalized communities such as the Latinx and trans communities. In many cases, what is known or said about us has been limited by the perspectives of those holding power, who often don't look or love or live as we do. For example, 60 years ago, society at large was sure that there were only two genders. And look at where we're at today, now. And so, as we struggle towards equity and liberation, we often rely on narrative change in order to foster policy and structural change. It's in this vein that we struggle to shift attention away from how we're described and instead towards how we describe ourselves and our priorities as a means of building our own power. It's also important to repeat at this point that language and knowledge are pragmatic. This means that no one way of speaking or sharing knowledge will ever be perfectly, permanently inclusive. Does this mean that we don't try to be more inclusive? Quite the opposite, actually. It means that we try often. We ensure that communities drive our efforts to be more inclusive and accurate. And it means that we record our attempts so that others can learn from them in the future. I'm going to go to the next slide. And so before I conclude with that frame, I wanted to highlight some examples of research within our network that use aggregate data and exemplify some of the inclusive data collection that we're talking about. Our partner Funders for LGBTQ Issues publishes regular annual tracking reports and related infographics, and has really been leading the way on data collection related to funding of trans communities. Don't worry if you can't read these pictures. We're going to share them as handouts after the webinar. But so that first graphic on the left-hand side is a infographic from the 2017 tracking report, which tracks data and trends related to grant making to LGBT communities from across the country. And what's great about this particular research on the part of funders is that it informs subsequent research. So they'll do pullouts of research from the National Tracking Report to examine key subsets of our community. For example, this infographic on the right, foundation funding for U.S. trans communities, is really an outgrowth of some of that tracking that they do every year on trends overall. In their trends, what they've found, for example, consistently, is that just 3 cents out of every $100 goes to funding of trans communities. And so from that data, they dole out more data on trans communities and have tailored some programming to sort of address that gap and meet that need. They have initiated, for example, the Grant Makers United for Trans Communities Pledge, which is a pledge that foundations can sign on to commit to learning more about and increasing resources to trans communities. And they've also similarly created the Grant Makers United for Trans Communities Fellowship to build the expertise and elevate the leadership of trans communities themselves. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I wanted to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. You'll hear from me a little bit again towards the end of the webinar with some more information about opportunities to connect with us in the field. But I'm going to turn it back over to Jasmine so that we can get into questions.
Thanks so much, Naja. This is just a really wonderful overview of this work and the way that you're moving through and thinking about work overall. Before we open it up to Q&A, I just wanted to pose to you a question about the ways to start to think about collecting demographic data. Oh boy, a lot's happening on my screen.
Sorry there, I just switched it over to my slides.
Oh, wonderful. So the ways that you might think about using the collection of demographic data to start to leverage conversations within your own organization.
So I can give Tanaja a moment to kind of think through that question and how to leverage those. And before we get too far into the Q&A, I just want to speak to a few pieces that are coming up, some opportunities, including 2 free opportunities on your screen now. So I first wanted to let you know about our free self-paced e-learning course, Diversity and Inclusion, Walking the Talk. This training explores leadership strategies that advance racial equity and inclusion in foundations and their partners, including the ability to see the larger system, foster reflection and more generative conversations, and shift the collective focus from reactive problem solving to co-creating proactive solutions. You'll see the bit.ly link here. I'll also post it in the chat momentarily. I also hope that you will join us again on September 25th for another free webinar in which we'll be sharing how to attract new donors this giving season with your nonprofit profile. Learn how to provide fresh information to our millions of users, including foundations and individual donors, as well as the millions more who visit our partner sites such as Charity Navigator, Facebook, Amazon Smile, and Network for Good. And don't forget, just like this webinar, if you attend any of our live webinars, you'll also get a recording so you can watch it on your own time. Also want to provide an opportunity to share one more opportunity with you, Change Philanthropy's 2019 Unity Summit. And Tanaja, I'll turn it over to you to speak to this one.
Thank you, Christine. So we just wanted to say, if you're a member of the philanthropic community that wants to learn more about Change Philanthropy, our partners, or our research agenda, we encourage you to join us for the Unity Summit this November in Seattle from November 18th to the 21st. We are hard at work building out a conference for grant makers that centers our communities and explores the themes of bridging and building power. It'll be a great opportunity to learn more about the priorities of communities directly from those communities, learn ways to shift your practice toward more equitable philanthropy, and then hear more from movement leaders directly. And so we've got a website, changeunitysummit.org, that you can go to register and learn more. We also have an early bird registration deadline where you can get a discount if you register before August 31st. And if you might need some additional resource to help you attend the conference, we've got a scholarship open, and that application also ends on August 31st.
All right. Thank you so much, Tanaja, and thank you to all of our presenters. And with that, I think we can really kind of jump into the Q&A. So, Jasmine, can you just restate your question for us one more time?
Sure. So I am hoping that, Tanaja, you can share just a couple of ideas that you might have about using the conversation of either research or the ways that someone might be sharing their demographic data on their profile to start an internal conversation at their organization around equity and research and practices.
Absolutely. I think that when you look at data, and specifically data that shows that there are disparities and differences in demographics, some people are underrepresented, some people might be overrepresented. I think the first question that you can ask at a leadership level and then trickle down to the rest of the organization is there anyone that's not here that should be, right? I always recommend that folks look at disparities within the context of their mission. So if your mission is to serve a particular group and sort of rectify a condition among a particular group, then you've got to ask yourself, is there any other role for this group, this stakeholder group, besides being the recipient of our services? How best can these folks inform our services? And have an open-ended question, an open-ended conversation about some of those things. And the another thing I would say is that also it's an opportunity to sort of challenge your own assumptions by listening to what other people might have to say and being open to the fact that you might get some different answers based on the people who are in the room.
Yeah, that is wonderful. Thank you so much for that insight.
All right, great. And I do see other questions coming in about how to have those conversations. So hopefully that answer helped as well. We did just get a question asking about why the provision of demographic data is separate from the transparency seals. And Jasmine, I thought you might be able to speak to that one.
Sure, that's a great question. Part of that is, so within the transparency seals, there are, or within the nonprofit profile overall, we have several sections that are separate from the seals of transparency. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, it's so that we can keep what those seals represent. So each one is, so bronze is more specific programmatic information, silver is financial, gold is your theory of change, and platinum is your specific metrics over time, how you measure your organizational progress. Part of it is that it does not fit specifically into those lenses, and so we wanted to keep that very clear. The other part of it is, particularly when we first started, we wanted to make sure that folks felt comfortable and ready to do this. It can be really scary for folks, and we want to lower the barrier for entry. So this is one way of saying, come in, the water is fine, start to share this information, and then we can start to think about what are the ways to add that to the seals of transparency.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I like that kind of analogy of just kind of dipping your toe in to start. We got a question during the presentation around disability information. So I was hoping you could speak to how disability information can be reported as part of the demographic portion of the profile.
Sure. So what we ask specifically as there's two categories: people who identify as a person with a disability and people who identify as a person without a disability. A disability can be defined in a ton of different ways. So mental health, chronic health conditions, physical, mental, intellectual disabilities, all of those fall under that category. The best way to identify that is to ask in an anonymous and consensual way. So through a staff survey, those kinds of things.
Great. We also were, and I think this speaks to Naja and Jasmine, you can both potentially speak to this one. We got some questions around if you're a really small organization and just recruiting people generally is a challenge. Maybe you're just one executive director in a small board. Do you have any advice for kind of small, especially startup organizations?
Advice for collecting and sharing demographic data.
For collecting, for collecting and sharing, and also for recruiting kind of a diverse board and diverse employees or staff or volunteers, which I know is a little bit beyond the scope, but I hope that helps clarify.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I think, and Tanaja, you can speak more to this, I think that kind of the way that Tanaja was framing that who is not here kind of question is a wonderful way to start thinking about how you might recruit. There's a ton of different kind of listservs and spaces for different affinity groups. I can imagine that that would be a wonderful place to start. There's lots of job posting subcategories and things like that. And I think that being mindful of how you present your job postings and doing some of that thinking through can be incredibly helpful. Tanaja, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would also add that another way to do this is to sort of look for people who are doing some of the similar things that you're doing. And even in the development stage, when you're developing your outreach materials and efforts, lean into some folks in your network that are already different or are doing similar things. And so, for example, you can reach out to individual affinity groups that are in the issue and look for within the issue affinity groups that already represent those folks. Professional associations are another good place to start because let's say, I don't know, maybe if it's a social work group or a medical nonprofit or things like that, the field itself, the profession itself or the issue area may have a diversity initiative already that you can lean into to find folks and then also find expertise in crafting your outreach or your message to attract some of those diverse candidates. So that's some of the things I would really suggest first, looking into the profession or the field and seeing that there are diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives already. And then also leading into your network of peers who are doing some of the same work, but also might be different for their expertise.
Great. Thank you both. I got a question that I think you'll be able to speak to. The question is, some senior leaders feel that asking folks to identify or assuming identification are reasons to not track data. Is there any way to track data and still be equitable and respectful to folks? So I know you have kind of one handout that kind of speaks to this, but I also was wondering if you had any initial thoughts.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, one, there's a handout around best practices for collecting demographic information. One thing that I will point out very kind of upfront is definitely your hunch that assuming identity is uncomfortable and icky is true. So you never want to assume, but you do want to ask in respectful and anonymous ways. And what makes that important is representation and being able to better understand and better serve the people who make your organization great, right? So having a fear around collecting that information is relatively natural, but I'd say the space to overcome that is making sure that you share with folks how you will use that data, in what ways that will inform your practices, making sure that that feedback is very clear. Will go a long way in that. And so there are some best practices around how to most respectfully collect that information, but I would say that having it is so much more important than avoiding that uncomfortable moment.
Great, thank you. We have a range of questions rolling in, which is super exciting. I also just want to mention in the chat, I did include the links, and they'll also be in your follow-up email, to one, that free self-paced course, Diversity and Inclusion Walking the Talk, and also we have the Attract New Donors this giving season with your GuideStar nonprofit profile. So those two pieces, but especially that first one, Walking the Talk, I think might also kind of provide some further additional pieces for folks. We had another kind of GuideStar profile specific question, which Jasmine, I imagine you can speak to. Is there subscription required to update your GuideStar profile?
That's a great question. No, there's not, and updating your profile overall is completely free. What you need to do is claim your profile, prove that you are connected to that organization, and then you're good to go.
Awesome, wonderful. And I'm sure if you have any additional questions, know that the help site that I included in the chat and the GuideStar help site is definitely there for you as well. The next question I have is regarding to, so does Candid have any plans to analyze all this demographic data submitted by nonprofits and foundations and to provide some benchmarks? So is that something we are planning in the future as we're collecting this?
Yeah, so we're planning and in the midst of a lot of analysis to share with the sector, and just insights as opposed to specific benchmarks. I think the space that we're in is wanting to share what we're learning.
Okay, great, great. Well, I know we're kind of rounding down when it comes to time, and I'll include resources if anybody has remaining questions. But I will just kind of reach out, ask one kind of final question in case you have any additional thoughts around, could you speak any more to starting dialogues within an organization about staff, board, and constituents? And this particular question comes from someone who has just been through a year of DEI self-examination, and they're getting an equity plan to integrate into their strategic planning. So if you had any particular thoughts about folks who have gone through some of that self-examination, building the equity plan in, how you might recommend they continue doing that work.
Oh, this is Tanaja. I think one of the things to do is sort of consider the levels of the organization where the conversation has happened, and definitely create an opportunity and feedback channels for different levels of staff to weigh in. And so in some of the ways I've seen this done, there has been an executive process, a managerial process, and then a layer of line staff or frontline folks have to have their process about equity in the organizations. And so making sure that people feel free and comfortable to provide honest feedback or revealing feedback without fearing sort of reprisal for their honesty is a real key point of making sure folks can have these conversations. Some folks, if they have the resources to do so, choose to bring in an outside facilitator to manage those conversations or do like a confidential or survey process to have some of those conversations. But then also there are ways, or if a member of the leadership or a certain staff person is trained to sort of facilitate the conversation, it's about really creating safe space for people with multiple at different levels of experience to weigh in. Is one thing that I would definitely say is an important thing. And then the other thing I wanted to end with is sort of really, as people we've said throughout the webinar, this is an uncomfortable process and sometimes there's a lot of fear. And I encourage people to lean reflexively into their fear and not just examine, just examine what it is specifically that is making you afraid, and sort of understand sort of the point of how fear motivates people to use their power and what the effect of that is on other people. Because we collect this data and we pursue equity because what marginalized communities are trying to do in many ways is combat erasure. And generally what we want to make sure is protect every community's ability to be seen and heard.
Well, I think that is an amazing note to kind of wrap up on. So I just want to thank you again, Jasmine, Tanaja, and I'm sure you'll pass it on to Andrew as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your expertise and your guidance today. And thank you to all the participants for attending today's webinar and asking some great questions. I want to just reassure you that you will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a link to watch the recording of today's webinar, as well as a short survey. And I know you probably see surveys come at you every day, all day, but I really welcome your feedback on this. It helps us plan future webinar offerings, as well as help us consider how we can craft the best webinar experience possible. And we do read every response that comes into our surveys. So thank you in advance for your thoughts there. On behalf of our team here at Candid and our presenters, thank you for joining us today. And if you like this webinar, we hope that you join us again soon. Have a fabulous rest of your day, and I'll include in the chat additional our help support folks where you can reach out to them if you do have any questions beyond today's webinar, and that will also be in the email. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and have a fabulous day.
All right.
Okay, just so you know, we'll debrief on a kind of separate line. So once I end the webinar, it'll be ended for everybody, including panelists.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so are we all debriefing together? Yeah, or?
We can. Can you send like a Zoom or something
Yeah,
by
let me put
email?
a Zoom link in the chat right now.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and send out some departing messages to our participants. I know, I know.